want to look at here this morning in chapter 2, Jonah's prayer. My brothers and sisters, there are three things that I want you to see here about Jonah's prayer, and then I'll leave you alone this morning. First, I want you to see where he prayed. Where he prayed. Note now the words in verses 1 and 2. It says there that then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the fish's belly, and he said, I cried out to the Lord because of my affliction, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. Notice that opening clause, then Jonah prayed unto the Lord his God. In chapter 1, remember, we see Jonah running from God. But here in chapter 2, we see Jonah running to God. Then Jonah prayed unto the Lord his God. You want to notice carefully that then in verse 1, because then marks a turning point. Then marks a point of transition. Then marks a defining moment in Jonah's experience. Then, after a season of rebellion and resistance, then, after a period of substituting his own will for God's will, then, after the flight, then, after the disturbance, after the storm, then, after being thrown off the ship and into the sea, then, after being in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights, then Jonah prayed unto the Lord his God. Look at him. His conduct begins to improve. Jonah is not the same man in chapter 2 that he was back in chapter 1. In chapter 1, he was haughty. But in chapter 2, he's humble. In chapter 1, he was prideful. But in chapter 2, he's prayerful. Back in chapter 1, he was stubborn. But here in chapter 2, he's submissive. I tell you, he's not the same man in chapter 2 that he is in chapter 1. There's been a change in Jonah. In his praying, observe, if you will, that he agrees with God. He submits to God, and then he honors God. And I need to tell you that as long as we are on the run, we don't really pray. As long as we think that we know better than God what's best for our lives, we don't really pray. As long as we are bent on doing wrong and traveling in the wrong direction, we don't really pray. We may go through the motions. You may get down on your knees. You may fold your hand. You may say, now, Father, I lift my hand unto thee. No other help I know. You may say, now I lay me down to sleep. Pray the Lord my soul to keep. You may say, our Father, which art in heaven. But until you have a mind to obey God, you're not really praying. You see, prayer is an activity engaged in by those who are willing to live in submission to the will of God. And I want you to hear me this morning, because you won't run to God until you first make up your mind to stop running from God. Then Jonah prayed unto the Lord his God out of the fish's belly. Jonah prayed out of the fish's belly. Jonah had a private prayer meeting inside the belly of a fish. He transformed his place of confinement into his praying closet. What a strange place to pray. I mean, out of all the places to pray, here Jonah is praying out of a fish's belly. Throughout the Bible, we read of people praying and calling on the name of the Lord from many places. No doubt, Noah prayed in the ark. Joseph prayed in the pit. The Hebrew boys prayed in the fiery furnace. Daniel prayed in the lion's den. Stephen prayed while being stoned to death. Paul and Silas prayed in the Philippi jail at the midnight hour. John prayed on the Isle of Patmos. Jesus prayed while hanging on Calvary's cross with nails in his hands and spikes in his feet. But praying from inside a fish's belly has to be the strangest place from which heaven's throne has ever been petitioned. It's such a strange place until skeptics have written off this entire episode of biblical antiquity as so incredulous and so unbelievable that it cannot be true, it cannot be factual, so they say it is only a parable because no man can live inside a fish's belly. As a matter of fact, they argue, Pastor Felton, that fish can't even swallow men. But the thing that they seem to overlook here is that this word says that the Lord prepared this fish to swallow Jonah. And I don't know about you, but as for me, it suffices and satisfies me to know that the Lord did it because my faith system causes me to accept that God can do anything but fail. Is there anybody here that believe that? He can do anything but fail. Things that are impossible with men are totally possible and plausible with God. Jonah was in the fish's belly not by accident but by divine design. God prepared the fish especially for Jonah. This was not just some ordinary fish, but I want you to know this was a custom-made fish. He was in the fish's belly, and since that is where he was, that was the place where he needed to pray. It wasn't an ideal place, but that's where he needed to pray. It wasn't the temple, but that's where he needed to pray. It wasn't an altar, but that's where he needed to pray. And Jonah reports that even though he prayed in the fish's belly, God still heard his prayer. Now let me throw two lessons at you right quick that we need to see here where Jonah prayed. The first lesson is this: God can hear us anywhere. If you'll help me tell your neighbor, God can hear you anywhere. You don't have to be in the sanctuary for God to hear you. Come on, talk to me, somebody. You can be riding along in your automobile talking to God, and he will hear you. You can be locked up behind prison bars, and God will hear you. You can be lying flat on your back in the hospital, but God can hear you. You can even be tore up drunk, high as a kite, on the ballroom floor, and God can break through your high, cause you to call out on his name, and he can hear you even right there. He can hear us anyway. But the second lesson is this: it's better to pray in normal situations than to wait until we are in strange surroundings to pray. In other words, I'm trying to convey to you that you ought to pray while you're up on your feet, rather than wait till you're on a hospital bed lying on your back. You ought to pray while you've got money in your pocket, rather than waiting until you're broke, busted, and disgusted. You ought to pray while you've got harmony in your home, and rather than waiting till your marriage is on the rock and you're headed to divorce court. You ought to pray in normal surroundings, normal situation. You ought to pray while you have your freedom and liberty, than to wait till you're facing jail time for doing some foolish activity. You ought to pray while the sun is shining, rather than waiting till stormy situations develop.